The Gypsy Wife quilt by Jen Kingwell has 10 sections, and section 7 is fairly easy. There's a lot of square and square blocks. Square and square with 2 borders, square and square with courthouse steps, square and square pinwheel, and then 2 sizes of just square and square blocks. Section 7 of the Gypsy Wife quilt is all variations of square and square blocks, but they can be a little tricky because of those variations. So to break down what we are going to be making, there are 2 3-inch square and squares, and I've got my squares and small squares cut out here. There are going to be 2 4-inch square and squares, so a little bit bigger squares for those 4-inch size squares. There is 1 square and square with pinwheel center, and this one can be a little tricky because what it does is you create your pinwheel. So you've got your fabric for the pinwheel, and then there's a border around that, and then there is the square and square part where there are triangles on the 4 edges. So this takes a little bit of finagling. The pinwheel center instructions are on page 19 in the pattern book, and it's page 19. It's the last pinwheel blocks section on that page. So once you make that, you have to go over to page 22 and follow the instructions for the square and square with pinwheel centers. Taking that pinwheel block, adding the borders, and then the final step is to add the square and square piece on the end on page 23. So 3 different pages kind of spread over for this block. It's not a difficult block, but tracking down those instructions can be a little difficult. There is also a square and square with courthouse steps. So it's going to be a bordered square. That becomes the square and square using the courthouse steps border as an interim step. And then there is a square and square with 2 borders. So the first step is to make the square and square, and then add the first round of borders, and then add the second round of borders. So I'm going to walk through each of these blocks, but I wanted to give you that overview because they are all square and square, but they are all very different. The square and square with 2 borders starts with a square and square block. So you will need a 3-inch square and square. Thank you for helping, Kitty. And then that center square is used for a courthouse steps with 2 rows of borders. And the resulting square and square with 2 borders block. The square and square with courthouse steps uses a center square, a border, and then finishes with the square and square triangles on the 4 corners. So we're going to add the border, and then opposite corners of triangles, press open, and then opposite corners to finish the block. And the finished square and square with courthouse steps block. For the square and square pinwheel block, we start with small squares that are cut in half diagonally. This will help form our pinwheel. And then use those triangles to create the pinwheel block. Stitch the triangles together, stitch those together in a row, repeat for the second row, and then attach the row together. And this will become the center for our pinwheel with the square and square block. So pinwheels can get a little wonky, especially the way that we're doing it by sewing the triangles together. And it's really important to square up the pinwheel before moving on to the next step. So this particular pinwheel for section 7 does need to be squared up to 3 inches. And then the next step is to add the 2 borders on opposite sides, stitch and press open, and then finish the borders on the other sides. So now that we have the bordered pinwheel center, we're just going to treat it like a square and square. And so 2 of the triangles on opposite sides. You don't have to trim, but do press open, and then finish it up with the 2 triangles for the final sides. And that will be the finished pinwheel square and square block. And there's the finished square and square pinwheel block. The 2 sizes of our standard square and square block, the 3-inch and the 4-inch. So you have 1 square in the center, and then you surround that square with triangles. Start out by sewing the squares on the corners, stitch diagonally, trim and press open, and then add the 2 opposite squares, trim and press open to create the final square and square. So 2 3-inch and 2 4-inch for our very familiar square and square. And that gives us 4 of the 7 blocks for section 7.